Go on in, everyone. Thanks for coming. If you've been to Tom and my sessions before, you'll know that we're really interested in where the sector is with digital recording and how we can better support. In our previous session, we at the inaugural Innovation Festival, we had presentations and we had discussion on where the sector is at the moment. And a lot of the discussion was around the pros and cons of how to move forward. We would like to know what the issues are currently. So we have some presenters who will be talking about their work in digital recording. We have Keith May and Mike Feider this morning. We will have a break approximately, I think I said 11. Just for 10 minutes to get a coffee. We'll come back to Kevin Wooldridge, and then we'll have more of an open discussion. So if I can hand over to Keith May, who is going to talk about his project on Matrix.
Thanks, Lucy. Let me find the share. Can everybody see that, and can you hear me? Okay, so the title, Tales from Two Riverbanks, and I'm asking the question, is there an increasing digital divide between development funded archaeology practice and research funded archaeological practice? Just to introduce myself, Keith May, I'm keen to emphasize here that I'm presenting here, I'm currently being funded by the AHRC for something called a Leadership Fellowship, which basically means I have money for a project called The Matrix, which is looking into issues of digital data and reuse. I'll start off talking a bit more about that. So although I have a job at Historic England, 50% of my time at the moment is being spent on this research funded project, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, although it obviously links in to other work I do at Historic England too. And just to also credit, as part of that Leadership Fellowship AHRC funding, I also work on the project with Dr. James Taylor at York University, who happens also to have been the co-field director at the Chattel Hewitt project. So there are some elements of that which feed in, which I might mention a little bit as I go through. And my other colleague, Kerry Binding at the University of South Wales, particularly on the computing side. I'm going to have a little bit of that, but mostly I'm going to talk about practice and reuse of data. And hopefully I can find out how to get the thing to move forward. There we go. So as a bit of background to this Matrix project, that's the research funding. There's sort of broadly 4 key areas, I'd say, that we're trying to look into. Actual, as I say, digital practice, particularly focus archaeological digital practice. So I'm looking at what people do, but to some extent, what the digital products, what are the digital elements that come from practice, and how, to some extent, is practice being changed by the use of digital methods. But very much the focus of the project comes from issues around reuse of heritage data. So I work, many of you will know, I work directly with ADS as part of my role at Historic England, and one of the things we're now really interested in is how we make best use of all the data that is now being preserved and presented and accessed through ADS or other digital repositories like ADS. And I think that's sort of one of the challenges and areas for innovation in itself going forward. I'm going to talk about quite a bit about stratigraphy principles and standards, because that part of the Matrix project, as the name implies, what we're kind of focusing on is as a reuse case study. I'm focusing on stratigraphic data, which I will argue is very fundamental to archaeological practice anyway, but there are particular reasons why I'm looking at that, because I'm also working with colleagues who are doing Bayesian chronological modeling, so it's critical for that. I'll talk a bit more about that, and I'll give you a real little glimpse of some research tools that we're working on, which are prototypes to try and help understand where practice is what kind of common practice there is across the sector. So the other point here, which I've highlighted in red here, is that what I'm dealing with in this project is particularly information derived from the commercial sector. So in a way, it's interesting that it's not historic England focused so much as we're trying to look at how data is getting to the archives from the commercial side, and looking at practice across the sector, where obviously the commercial side is a huge proportion of that. And looking at how we can ensure more consistent development, application, promotion of technical information and standards as part of that work. So I started on the project, as I say, because we're looking at the archives and we're looking at reuse. One of the areas that I've come across through other work, I've done other research projects which over 10 years ago, it looked into trying to use various technologies for reusing data from multiple excavations by different organizations. And so I wanted to look at practice. We had questions around not so much the data coming directly off site, but data that had then been analyzed and had sort of, well, through the process of analysis, data will change. And therefore we decided to go out and talk to, for in terms of the project, 10 major archaeological organizations across the UK, and talking with FAME, and initially with an intention of sort of trying to distill best practice, so looking for documentation of what people were doing with stratigraphic data, things like phasing and grouping processes. And I had some sense, I knew that trying to find out whether there were already, you know, documentation of these processes that we could pull together into something common. So the questions I was asking, you know, are there documented formal post-ex, if you're happy to use the term post-ex, analysis procedures in your organization? If yes, are you prepared to share them with me, or can we share them further? Or if not, what are the kind of reasons why there weren't documentation? And that, to be honest, became more of the question, because it was perhaps one of the outcomes of the project already is surprising that there weren't as many examples of that as I thought there might be. In fairness to some sites, infrastructure sites, we'll give a shout out to Alex Smith at Headland, who sent me a really good piece of very recent documentation from the A14. But it was more the exception than the rule. So that's one question I think for us to talk around in terms of what people do. It's not to say people don't have good practice in their post-ex, but it's interesting that it's not necessarily, and it's understandable the way that it's not as well documented. For recording purposes, everyone goes out on site, they obviously need a manual. It's really clear why you need manuals when you're recorded on site, and even so that, you know, into assessment, we all have good practice. And pretty much everyone I talked to was very happy to sort of show me their recording forms, their recording process. But it was the bits after that that we're sort of interested in most now. And the crucial question is, what experience people have of trying to reuse any data at all from other excavations, other sites? And again, there was a general sort of sense, you know, within the organization that was more common. Clearly, you know, in people excavating in urban areas, they would do multiple sites, they would share, they would have their own systems, they could share data to, you know, or they had data within the system. But in terms of trying to think about what goes into archives, and the work I've tried to do where you're trying to look across data for multiple organizations recorded on different platforms using different bits of technology, that's a pretty different question. Moving on, again, give you more background to why we're focusing on stratigraphic data, particularly because we were looking for information data to inform Bayesian chronological modelling. And I have parallel work of a PhD student at Sheffield called Brian E. Moody, who's been looking for primary stratigraphic data that's recorded on site, and went to ADS when we to see what sort of data was available. We had some data in some research excavation, but to be blunt, there's not a lot of data from the commercial sector on ADS. There's a lot of OASIS reports, and it was pointed out at one point, a sort of comment made, I have in quotes here, that, oh, well, the data must be archived in matrix diagram records. But looking at the reports, I think Brian, this vendor around pretty sort of says she was looking for stratigraphic data or the diagrams, and we had like 150 diagrams out of 10,000 projects that mentioned stratigraphy, and that's out of a sample of 37, whatever it says there, 37 plus thousand plus reports. Say 10,000 of them did have stratigraphy, but then 153 actually had a diagram in the report. So somehow it's hard to, basically it's hard to get hold of that data. And for the things like the chronological modeling, they were just talking about simple tables like three columns. This context has a stratigraphic relationship to another context, but it's not commonly there at the moment. That's not to say people are recording it. I know people have it in their own records. So why do I think the stratigraphy is important? I hope most people who are working at excavation level would accept that stratigraphy is crucial to understanding the site. I use this analogy that it's kind of like the skeleton of the site. You might have a site, if you're digging in a deep Bergen center, you'll have a deep skeleton going down. If you're perhaps out in a rural site, you might have a wide skeleton, more like a snake-like skeleton going across, but it does character. There's an element of characterizing how the site is. Even more critically, though, the data is crucial in terms of relating other data, that all the finds data and environmental data that links through in analysis. And what we also find that another issue with the archives is even when there is a matrix diagram, it's often only kept as a PDF, which, to be frank, it's better than nothing and is not a problem as long as you've got the data relationships in tables as well. But if you only have a PDF, you're faced with a real task of having to sort of like retype the data back in to reuse it, which is not really sensible. So I'll argue here briefly there's a need for a consistent format for preservation, interchange, sharing and reuse of the stratigraphic relationships. So that's basically the below, above, context levels and the diagram ideally, and then we can do work on that with things that I'll talk about a bit further through. And just to sort of address another area which might be interested in this question of sort of innovation and what we're doing with data. I accept the sort of argument that excavation is a one-off process and unrepeatable, and we often say that because it's a crucial reason why the archive is so important to us, and why digital archives are even more important in terms of having access to the data. But it's interesting to think that once the data is off the site and has been collected, then to some extent it is repeatable. What we do with the data once we've got it is repeatable. So there's a point there that in terms of sort of scientific practice, being able to show what you've done with your data so that other people can do good science in a sort of, Karl Popper would say that some good science means you have to be able to repeat the outcomes of your experiment. I would argue that that's actually an argument for being clear in what you do to analyze it, given odd exceptions where obviously we do occasionally destroy stuff, like when we do C14 on bone samples. So to address where perhaps there are some of these sort of issues around why perhaps we're not finding consistent data in the archives, I tried to do something called process modeling. So it really, as I say, trying to distill common steps in the analysis process from these interviews with what became more of a sort of personal communications from people rather than straightforward documentation, in order to really sort of try and map across the commonalities in what they would do, what people are doing. And this diagram, I don't expect you to try and read all the details. Sorry, you know, it's small, but this comes back to the title of the paper, Why the Tales from Two Riverbanks, because I kind of felt that there's this kind of common flow of information in a common process. Is this idea that we do an excavation, we assess the stuff, we then if we're lucky, we have the money to do the analysis and work toward on all the data from the site and do work towards a publication and then move to archive. That's the sort of, people can debate, but I think that's still the sort of idea, general view of how it goes. And if you have research funding, to say that still is the basic model, a very simple overview, but people plan that they will get the data through and analyze it and be able to publish. They have enough money to publish an archive. But what I would say, argue with commercially funded sites, and the reason there's the big diamond in the middle is really this point assessment that a lot of sites are reaching this hiatus. How many people here from the commercial sector, but they may hopefully will recognize this, that often you tend to get the site to a point of assessment, or some people refer to it as still refer to a stratigraphic report, but then there may not be money. The site may not have as much information that people feel they need to publish it straight away. So there's a hiatus where perhaps we go, oh, we'll get 3 or 4 sites together and publish. So whatever the reason, the various reasons that people could come up with, there is often a point where maybe the OASIS report is, ideally the OASIS report is sent to the archive, to ADS, but data doesn't go with it. And I think that's part of one of the issues that we're dealing with, why Bryony didn't find a lot of the stratigraphic data. But what I was sort of trying to do with this model is inform sort of some of our work on development so that we could go forward. And I would argue that although I've modeled this as a straight linear process, it's not entirely that. It really, we're talking about the excavation data, then stratigraphic data gets analysed, and there are things that change in that, or at least they evolve. They are analysed into groups and phases and land use, whatever, further, and then stratigraph the actual published version of the data, whether it's people publish the diagrams or not is a question. Then there's still a point where people say, okay, the site's going to be archived, but we're going to remember that your archive is where perhaps the next excavation will start. If somebody wants to dig the site next door, they need to be able to sort of at least understand where your trenches were. And I would just arguing that it's more of a cycle for research purposes. You need to think that what we put in the archive should be most useful to people coming afterwards. Now, I fully appreciate that most people have to spend their focus on the site they're working on, and that's understandable that we all kind of maximize the time finishing the data on the site that we're on. But I think it is one of the issues why data is not perhaps traveling into the archives quite as consistently as it might. Just to give a flavor of the background to why I've been so interested in this, like 10 years ago, I did a project around data interoperability. So this was the STAR project. If people aren't aware of this, it was published in Internet Archaeology in 2011 under Professor Doug Tudhope's name and mine. And it's really just emphasizing here, this diagram is using graph data technologies, which at that point 10 years ago were still quite innovative and have developed more since. But again, showing these basic, the occurs before, occurs after stratigraphic relationships between all the contexts, but trying to give you the sense here that the other data links off that, so you can search through the stratigraphy and then move to searching for finds with this or samples or other things, really whatever you want, if you've got that sort of spine of data. What that research also led me into was looking at temporal relationships, and just briefly to touch on the fact that although we record the before and after and equals, above, below, if you like, and equals strat relations, there are other relationships in diagrams, particularly when we do analysis and do phasing, where we show, if it's common practice to do phases with lines between, or however we do it, you're basically talking about phases meeting in time. When you're correlating on a matrix, you move things up and down to say, oh, I think this group actually overlapped with that group in time. And phasing itself is talking about data that occurs during a phase. That's literally almost like, I would say, one definition of a phase. So that's just an example from Silbury Hill, because it's a nice matrix that, but again shows practice here that it was put into an Excel sheet. But even though that is a nice example in Excel, I cannot programmatically use that data easily, because those are just numbers and all the lines between there are just graphical lines. They're not programmably reusable. And I love this photo as a prize, not a real prize, but anyone recognizes the back of my colleague's head. This is how a photo shared by James Taylor from Chapel Hewick of my colleague Alex Bayliss doing Bayesian chronological analysis, the traditional way of literally lying on top of the printed out matrix diagrams, even though they have, they have all their data in the database. But you know, this still reflects one part of practice, which I believe we might be able to innovate and do a little bit more better. And that's part of the work I'm doing with my colleagues at Sheffield, Professor Caitlin Buck, working on updating chronological modeling work. And just to dwell a bit more on the question around the semantics, even talking with people like Tom Dyer and Caitlin Buck have been working on this stuff, and they have Tom has this interesting definition of phasing as a groups exist. A phase groups context of similar age, and a period groups phases of similar age, which is fine, leading to a nested series of time intervals. I'm not arguing with that, but I just couldn't resist pointing out that, and I've shown this to Ed Harris himself at a SAA seminar in July, and the Harris Matrix Composer software talks about phase and represents structural relations and temporal relations, and therefore it's, although they're not contradictory, it's quite complex to actually relate the data from the semantics of the way in which they're working on these, and it's doable. But I'm just really making a point here that we use these terminologies kind of interchangeably, and perhaps having a little bit more, again, consistent, even just noting in when the data is deposited which methodologies we are using and what we mean by some of these terms in the methodologies we are using is helpful in terms of data reuse. To kind of pick out that, this is a bit I was going to say, to show you using period terms, perhaps this is just an example where we're using linked open data. Again, this is a prototype system, but we've got using this from an Ariadne European project. You can see there's 142 different vocabularies for period terms that exist across Europe or elsewhere. There's ones at Iceland there. I'm narrowing this down. I won't surprise you to say I'm picking the one that works for the historic England centric periods, but it is allowing us then to sort of make data spatio-temporally relevant, in the sense that if you're talking about the Bronze Age and you happen to be, your site happens to be in Greece, your date ranges will be different for the Bronze Age, or dare I even say it, Roman, will mean different things even across the UK. And we, these vocabularies do cover Scotland and Wales, so there are different terms depending on where you are. This is not to say everyone doesn't do it this way, but it just demonstrates that having some consistency, being able to point to the actual terms that you mean in and keep that as integrated in with the data is useful. That was on a loop, so I'll move on. Further things coming out of the research, just this slight dichotomy between the funding, I kind of touched on it in the process modeling. Funding sources have a real influence on, I think, what data ends up in the archives, and as I sort of said, and recording methods. And there is some kind of relationship between the two. I'm not going to go into complexities of that here, but it may be for discussion. So just trying to map where funding on different project development funding, research funding, as I said, can influence how much gets through into archive, but also what we're really interested in at the moment is how GIS is perhaps changing some of the or has influenced and changed practice in the last 20 years in terms of what data comes through. So I think there, there's a discussion there, and we feel, you can see Kevin nodding, the structure of emotion and as well, so that how people group things. Certainly it was feedback I had from Alex Smith at Headland around the fact that grouping can be done through the GIS, and maybe you don't need complex matrix diagrams in certain cases, depending on the type of archaeology. So I'll speed up because I think time is getting on. This is really just to reflect on Harris again in terms of, has the stratigraphic process matured? Is the fact that he wrote this, a lot of the principles in '89, so whatever that is, 30 more years ago. Has it matured, or is it still evolving? To some extent, perhaps we need to re-examine some of this. And I think the taking the diagram from Harris's book, the sort of general view was you would have a stratigraphic data, it would go through analysis to be published in the archive. But I'm just sort of making the point here that on different sites, perhaps if you're a deep urban stratigraphic site, that is like the Museum of London work on, that method still holds, and it's really useful to be able to go through doing the diagrams. But perhaps our rural sites, so shallow rural stratigraphy, isn't necessarily, you can do stuff on GIS, which kind of speeds the process up. But for things like the archive afterwards, there's still questions around the consistency and reusability. And I would say understanding the methods is a key part of understanding the data. And perhaps that's an area where we need to think more about that in terms of for reusability. And making, I'm using this term fair, making the byproducts of fair. So coming towards the end, in terms of sort of conclusion of this, I think I'm arguing for consistent standards in the digital and stratigraphic and temporal relationships, because that's what I'm focusing on. But of course, in a case, it's a use case study to demonstrate the value of this for reusability. But those principles can apply to other data, but trying to demonstrate where people most need the data for reuse, I think would be helpful in helping people understand what is best to put in their archives digitally. And at the moment, the picture is still quite, as I say, it's inconsistent. Individual archives may be consistent, but they don't necessarily look so consistent when you look across different sites or different organizations. Just a plea that the data is fit for reuse, because in the end, if you deposit an archive, I have this phrase, if an archive that is never reused is literally useless. So if people are faced with having to rekey data in from a PDF document, then it's really a barrier to reuse, and it would be good to think about having both data, primary data, and the diagrams. As I mentioned, I had a symposium with Ed Harris himself at Society for American Archaeology, and he was suggested this idea of potentially a need for some sort of international convention around stratigraphic data. I think he still feels slightly frustrated that a lot of people accept the principles of stratigraphy, but it's not as widely used, particularly outside, dare I say, outside the UK, as this is a largely UK audience, I suspect. And that's a challenge, as I've worked on European projects as well and had to map data across recording systems from Germany and elsewhere, and that really is, for those that have dug in Germany know there's questions around the Planum side of things. And I'm advocating sort of fair stratigraphic data, what that might look like, the idea that we need it to be findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. And I know my colleagues that historically have done a lot of good work on advocating data management plans, and I think that's an area again where we can help identify data that is useful for future purposes. And those are just some references I put a link to the matrix project at the bottom there, which I might chuck in the chat if I remember. And just a shout out to Daft Davis's paper, which is a badge report. If anyone hasn't seen this, 2017, it was based on, he did an MSc at York, but development of archaeological post-excavation with the British Professional Archaeology, on BAJR, does talk a lot more in detail and interviews a lot more people around post-ex. So if people are interested in sort of background to that, I would certainly have a look for that. It's online if you search for it there. And I think that's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith. So what we were hoping is if there's any questions specific to Keith's talk, we could have them now, or if they're going to cover a number of papers or thoughts, we could include them in the discussion later. I can see on the chat there is a message from CV Matt. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask it, or shall I ask it here? Okay.
I've just put the link to the matrix page in the chat. Sorry, Lucy.
That's all right.
I'm not reading the chat, actually.
No, you're presenting. That's what we're here for. So with the GIS approach to stratigraphic data, would this be interoperable with some of the new approaches by EH, AOC, MOLA on deposit modelling and the forthcoming deposit module package by, I don't know this one,
Exegesis. Yeah, Exegesis, who aren't going to be just be taken over by someone else. That's the question to me. Okay, I'm not sure what I mean. Maybe the broader discussion, I would throw this open. The GIS approach to stratigraphic data. Is there a GIS approach to stratigraphic data? I would love to, because I'm not sure that I was saying there necessarily was. I mean, what I was touching on is the fact that you can group stuff within the GIS. I guess what they're hinting at is that you can bring in the deposit modeling as part of that. Yes. As a non-geoarchaeologist, I can talk off the top of my head and say I don't see why not, but I certainly don't know if it's in anything to do with an exegesis package. And in terms of software, I would argue for data. I'm kind of trying to avoid advocating specific software packages. In a way, that's kind of why we're kind of prototyping on the basis that it allows people to say what is or isn't good in what they do. Does anyone else? Tom.
Yes, I was just going to jump in on that last point about packages. Given how volatile the computer industry is and how much things have changed. I mean, when Ed Harris published in 1989, nobody was putting anything in computers because we didn't have them. So I think we need to make sure whatever we produce is independently robust as a concept to fit whatever package is the flavor of the day in 10, 20, 50 years, when, you know, we talk to our computers rather than type into them and so on and so forth.
Thanks. We have, I'll note that down to come back to during the discussion as needed. I've got a question from Ed. Ed, do you want to unmute yourself about the good practice? Hello, Ed.
You're muted, Ed.
Oh, there we go. No, hi, Keith. No, it was just to, you mentioned in one of your slides, good practice in sort of preparing stratigraphic data as sort of like paired columns. I think that's a really interesting idea. I just wanted to check where that good practice is sort of published, because I think that should be something we should maybe be pushing a bit further.
The simple answer is I wouldn't say it is published directly anywhere. I'll put a link in to Bryony's latest research paper, which has just been published in Journal of Archaeological Science, where they make a plea for how they would like data for chronological modeling. Now, I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is that's a use case.
Yep.
I think it would make a good basis. I asked Caitlin to lay it out in a three sort of like a three principles of what they would like, so that people can see that. But that's why I'm kind of moved. This idea of an international convention would be to sort of try and say, you know, there might be a number of use cases, and yes, there's a minimum. I would argue there are various ways you could lay out the columns. I don't want to go, but yeah, 3 columns. It could be a context related to a context. Some people can even do it in 2 columns, but yeah, it's broadly saying what the relationship is between contexts. I'll put Bryony's paper in the chat. Unfortunately, it might be behind a paywall at the moment, but if you have access to Journal of Archaeological Science, if not, send me a private email. I may be allowed to share it, I'm not sure.
Evan, I think you've got your hand up there.
I listened carefully to Keith's presentation, and I noticed that he avoided mentioning the elephant in the room, which, as far as I'm concerned with archives, is metadata. And you know, my view is that any kind of archived digital data is actually useless unless we have metadata explaining how and why and where it was produced, and the circumstances that go under that, so that can contribute to that. You know, so I think we do have to go back to sort of basic principles when it comes to that sort of thing, and make sure that people are actually aware that data on its own in a digital format isn't much good unless we kind of take those factors into account. The second point is that you know, GIS has a basic rule, which is that you assess certainty and uncertainty. And that's the other thing that I don't see in archaeological digital data. I don't see people describing certainty or uncertainty factors that have gone into producing their end result. Now, I know why it's difficult, because we don't actually have a scale. You know, we can't, you know, somebody can say, well, you know, I'm pretty uncertain, I'm not so certain, but, you know, I think in digital format, it needs something which is a bit more precise. And again, that goes back to principles. I think, you know, maybe this international standard could address both of those questions and make sure that, you know, people are preparing digital data for archives in a format that will in the future make them useful.
Thanks, Kevin. That's really good. The concerning thing is obviously something with the Bayesian side. We're trying to look into that, and I may hopefully by the end of the project in middle of next year. I'm going off to see Kate. That's why I'm going to Sheffield next week to see Caitlin. So we're going to wrestle. It's really difficult, as you say. It's tricky, but at least surfacing degrees of certainty where there are elements of certainty, I think might be helpful if we can find a way of being a little bit more explicit about it. I hesitate to suggest we'll get a simpler. No, we won't get a simpler. And of course, it relates Bayesian thing because of the way they use a priori statements for Bayesian, but you have to be really careful where you introduce data, because Caitlin is really careful to say you shouldn't use data twice in Bayesian modeling, otherwise you're biasing, you know, you're breaking the Bayesian a priori principle. So it's quite tricky, but thanks, it's a good point.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? No, I think we're good. Thank you so much, Keith. Can we move on to Mike Feider, please? Hello, Mike.
Right, is that sharing all right, hopefully? Okay, I'm Mike Feider. I'm the digital data archaeologist at Historic England, and the title is Clue. I manage the recording system you use, Intrasys, and all the hardware networking stuff that goes with that. And I also get involved with archiving everything at the end. So I'm pretty much involved from birth to death of archaeological data. I worked in IT for several years before getting into archaeology, managing systems. But all the way back then, we weren't the IT department, we were the systems department. And I've always considered myself a systems person. I'm less concerned with the fancy little bits of technology than does this do what we need it to do to accomplish whatever overall goal we're going, which is a pretty rare thing in IT these days. But it does mean that I think in terms of systems, and I'm the annoying guy who always asks, but why do we do it that way? But it does mean I'm good at spotting ways we can fix things, which might have some ideas that can help us tackle some more digital woes. Right, we'll start off by talking about both systems, paper and digital, together. So it all kind of fits into the same basic system, and a system is just a collection of processes and procedures to do something. When we talk about system modeling, it's basically, the system is the whole thing, the processes are the sort of the general steps. So you record a context, and the procedures are, you take a context sheet, you fill out field 1, blah, blah. Just background if I use those terms again. Right. I've kind of put a very basic system model there of what happens. You have raw data, you process it, and at the end you get a set report and an archive. And you can reuse the archive as raw data for another project. I'd say that's a pretty good summary. I don't think I'm being controversial when I say that the site report has generally been the most important thing there that people have cared about. It's not as useful for actually getting your data because that is a summary of the site with someone's idea of what's important. But depending on what kind of research you're doing, it's not the best. And just as an aside, here's a nice picture of a library. I spent over 2 years collecting data on chicken-related objects from Northwest Europe. And in this particular library, I started at just the left edge of frame there, and I went down to where that kick stool was, going through every single book, skimming it for information. And sometimes I would find useful stuff. Sometimes I would find they found something chicken related on site somewhere. Obviously getting the information out of the archive for that many sites isn't really good, but if they were all in a nice, easy to search system, you following the FAIR principles, I would have a much easier time. I could go to the PAS and a few simple search terms, get everything I needed out of there in a couple of days. Anyway, skipping that aside, regardless of how we're dealing with this stuff, we need to put the same thought into it. So a lot of thought's gone into designing context sheets and skeletal recording sheets. We need to make sure we're doing the same thing with the digital recording stuff. Right, talk about paper now. And this is something you hear a lot. It's so much easier with paper. I'm the wrong person to come up with positive things to say about paper because I've been paper free for many, many years now. But you can see we've got a nice stack of context sheets there from a site. And if you were going through them, you might say things like, what does that say? Because you can't read someone's handwriting. Or you might go, oh no, it's wet and the pen is smeared, or someone used the wrong kind of pen, it's muddy. And you're wondering about noodled. I did actually find in the archive once, dried lo mein noodles stuck between context sheets. A little harder to do that with digital stuff. And obviously, when you have giant stacks of paper, it's hard to actually search them for anything or compile them in ways you didn't plan on. So if you decided you wanted to go and find, all the post holes or something, and you didn't come up with another system, you'd have to go through and pull them out manually. I think a lot of people have probably done that in the past and know it's not fun. But there are a few good things you could do with paper, which we'll touch on now that we talk about digital data, which has always been somebody else's problem. Well, it's the future now, so it is our problem. We finally need to start dealing with it. And the biggest difference is paper data is something a human is designed to read, and anything that's digital needs to be designed for a computer to read it. Now, computers are very stupid. When you tell it this field is for this kind of data, that's what it expects to find there. It can't look at it and say, oh, well, someone's put 2 pieces of information in this one field. It needs to have it broken apart so it knows how to deal with it. And if you're not actually making your digital data computer readable, then you're kind of missing the point. And I've done a nice little diagram here, kind of summing up how we do things now. Obviously, some people are better than others, but generally, someone collects data, dumps it in a big bucket, and anyone who wants to use it has to rummage through to find it. Now, back to paper. One of the good things it has is it has a higher tolerance for not being done right, because it's a human looking at it, and you can look through and say, oh, someone put this in the wrong field, or you skimming through looking for someone talked about trench 3. You know, if it's just in the text somewhere, they can spot it better than a computer can. Obviously, computers can't think like that, which takes us back to point 1. Another thing with the physical stuff is it's grown organically over a very long time. People started off scribbling things in notebooks on bits of paper, just doing sketches, which became better side drawings, until we got with context sheets like we have now, which had a lot of thought put into them generally. But when you do digital stuff, you have to start out sort of at the end. You need to think about what it's going to be like at the end of the process. You can't do it organically or it ends up really, really messy, which I think a lot of us have discovered over the years. The biggest thing with digital data is it's to make it easy for other people to use, and that includes you. You in the future as another person. So we want to make it so that anyone who picks this up can use it. That's one of the strengths of it. And being in a computer, the computer can easily scan through and find all the stuff that a person would take ages to do. So, things that scare me about where we are now. Biggest one is lost data. Is, you know, how much of this stuff just disappears. Recording it doesn't mean it's saved forever. We have to do something with that. You wouldn't take a context sheet and put it right into a shredder. We need to make sure we're not doing exactly the same thing with digital data. It has to be preserved and archived. Tom has described things now as the Wild West, where everybody's doing their own thing. We need to come up with some kind of standards. Otherwise, we're going to end up with lots and lots of incompatible data that we just can't do anything with. And going back to point 1, if it's not archived, it's the point anyway. And then clogged data, which we'll talk more about later, is something else that scares me. It's this data that's not quite lost. It's just stuck somewhere. Someone's either started working on it or someone retired halfway through. This is the stuff that's still there in potential, but could just never be finished. Or it could be something that's stuck in a system, still there, but not being archived. So these are all the kind of things we want to address and come up with as you're dealing with. And there are actually a lot of good resources kicking around out there. I'm not going to go into detail on all of them. The first one, let's say the Dig Digital, does touch on a lot of the other ones. And a lot of these use the FAIR principles, which Keith has helpfully already talked about today. And that just means findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. And this isn't actually something new. This concept has been around as long as digital data has, essentially. It's just the terminology changes. People come up with new buzzwords and fancy ways of talking about it. But basically it just means you want to make sure that your data is something that is understandable. People know what it is. They can open it. You know, it's got to be in a format, both sort of internally, so that once they open it, they can read it, and externally, they have something that can open it, and something that can be reused. So keep it sane. So people can easily say, this is the bit of data I want to stick it here. And it has to be something you can find. So name it something sensible and make sure it's cataloged somewhere. Not exactly unusual concepts. The problem with a lot of these guides is when people read them, you get responses more like this. So a lot of them are sort of written at a very high level or don't really talk about how you use it, how you apply that data. And like everything in life, it comes down to communication. And people who make these guides sometimes need to get a lot better at presenting them. And it comes down to sort of the author knowledge versus the audience knowledge. How much do you need to sort of talk down to your audience? You know, how much do they know? How much can you skip? And figuring out how to bridge that gap is a big thing. And of course, the same issue with the data itself. This comes down to the metadata, which people seem to be afraid of metadata. I think just the word scares them. All it is just documenting what you do. It's not that difficult. Just make sure you know what it is, say what it is. Don't assume anybody else is going to figure it out. Again, just communicate. And the best way to do that is just be clear, be concise, and try to avoid excessive use of jargon. So if you can't describe what you're talking about without buzzwords, maybe you don't understand what you're talking about enough to be talking about it. Obviously, there are some times where you need the technical terms, but if you can explain without them, do. So how can we actually go about taking all of these guides and all of these strange concepts and applying them to what we do and coming up with standards that will help all of us? Well, after the conferences earlier in the year, I was sitting thinking about that same question, and I came up with, oh, it's just a data pipeline. It's just a big system, essentially. You put stuff in one end, you get stuff out the other. And of course, inside the pipeline, there's lots of little pipelines spitting out tinier bits of data that all flow into the next bit. It's just a fairly simple, high-level model for thinking about your data. And it can involve lots and lots of process maps. But I think if we just stick to the high level, we can start coming up with some kind of guidance to end up with a system more like this, where whoever's recording the data kind of puts it in the right slots, stuff happens to it, it comes out at the end, everything is nicely organized, people can find exactly what they need, it's just easy to use. Now, from our talks earlier, we know people want guidance telling them how to manage all these things, but from experience, we know people don't like us coming in and telling them what to do. Now, a system like this pipeline is good because it doesn't actually tell you what to do inside your internal systems. It's more about thinking, all right, we all have this stuff that's going in and this stuff that's coming out. Let's just figure out how to deal with those. Just common inputs, common outputs. And a lot of these have reference material out there. So it's just saying this indecipherable thing makes a lot more sense when you look at it with the thing it goes with. And we also kind of want to get people to think a bit more about the data itself. And this can be a good way of doing that because you're thinking about all of the data get together. So you can pick out little bits. You can think about what's primary data, what's secondary data. And that basically just means, the primary data is like your main site database. So all of your context records, finds records, things like that. And secondary data is anything that's derived from that. So you might make a map of site. And I can pick on Keith a bit here, since he's already talked about this, the Harris matrix a bit. So all of his relational data between the things, that's sort of primary data. And the Harris matrix itself is something that's created from that data. So that's kind of the secondary data. So you can see there's a relationship between them, but they kind of are conceptually separated. And we also want to get people to avoid system fragmentation. So that basically means you don't record some stuff in this little bubble and then kind of more stuff over here, because it just gets more difficult. You don't want to do some context processing here, some context processing over there, because you just make a lot more work yourself. You can think about how you can just keep the stuff together that needs to be together and then split off where it's necessary. And the primary and secondary data helps you think about that a bit, because you can think primary stays together, secondary can go out. And the idea of a pipeline also makes it clear that the stuff needs to go through the system. It can't stay in there forever. It's got to come out the other end, which is important. So how exactly does the data pipeline work? What does the model look like? And it's something basically like this. So you got your big pipeline in the middle there, stuff going in one end, coming out the other. You can see stuff is flowing through it. So we got your inputs, which for us would be site records, your survey data, photos, reference data set from the last time you dug there possibly, or any existing maps. All that goes in, and you can see stuff is happening inside the pipe, all flowing one direction. There's lots of little bits of metadata that get attached everywhere, just explaining what is this data, and what's happened to it so far, what's happening to it now, just so you know what's actually going on. And then eventually you get to the other end, where you create your things like the site report, your archive. You can create a new reference data set that can be reused. And if there's any special images you make or journal articles, anything like that. And we don't care so much about what happens in the middle. That's up to your organization. Whatever you do there, as long as it's sort of spitting the stuff out at the other end in the right formats, we don't care. And you can see there's also a few little side bits on the pipeline. Up at the top here, there's some site data coming out, which you might send off to an external specialist, where they process their bits and they give you back new data, which can then be re-injected into the pipeline. So it's not just stuff goes in once. Stuff is constantly coming into the pipeline as you go along. And at the bottom there, you can see we've got sort of some standard vocabularies, data templates, anything that's there to kind of help you manage the data that isn't really the data itself. That can go in there too. And a lot of this stuff is described in other places. So all we need to do is just say, when you want to do this, here's the resources for it. And everything that goes into the pipeline has to come out, even if that's just waste data, like you can see dumping out the bottom there. In archive terms, we talk about sort of, you select things for the archive, and that's basically all this is. If stuff's not going into one of these outputs, then just acknowledge that you're getting rid of it. You wouldn't think people need to be told that, but sometimes you just need to know that not everything needs to actually be archived. You can just dump stuff. And since we're talking about pipes, big thing with pipes is you don't want to clog them up. We've all read about these disgusting fatbergs that people find clogging up sewer pipes. Don't make a data fatberg. Stuff can't live in there forever. It's got to come out. It can go really, really slowly, and in archaeology it does. But it's got to come out. We have to acknowledge that it's got to come out. It can't just be, I've recorded it, it's in the system, it's fine. At some point it has to be exported, archived, deleted, moved into a reference data set, which can be the same system. You don't have to take it out of a database, put it into a new database. They can stay in your same recording system. It's just conceptually, you need to say, this is done now. And then hopefully store it some way that other people can find it. And we can also think a little bit more about what's actually inside this pipeline. We did say we didn't care too much about what was going on there, but the actual sort of data molecules we do need to talk about. If we assume it's a water pipeline, well, if you remember chemistry, water molecule needs to be the right shape and have the right components to actually function as a water molecule, or you get water you can drink and you'll die of thirst. Data molecules are the same way. They need to have the right shape for their function. And here I've thrown in a photograph, which has got just little bits of metadata explaining what it is. Otherwise, what's that a photo of? Who knows? Have to know what it is. And something more complicated, like a database record, which might have lots of fields attached to it and child records. They can get really, really complicated. But if you think about these little chunks of data from the beginning and what they need to look like at the end, just design them at the beginning to look what they need to look like, instead of getting halfway through and having to spend lots of time and effort fixing it, which we want to avoid, obviously, especially in the commercial sector where time is money. And with a lot of this stuff, it is hard work, but it's always going to be hard work. You have to put the effort in up front when it comes to computers if you want to get the most out of them. And that's what we are now. It's what we need to really sit down, think about what we're trying to do, so we can go from the bad data management picture on the top here to the good data management picture on the bottom. And I think this pipeline model was good for that, because it does make people think more about all of this is part of the same system. It's not, I record my contexts, they're fine, it's somebody else's problem now. It's, that goes into a system that then has a next step, somebody else goes on with that step, and just on and on forever. Until it gets to the end. You need to think big picture, and I think this will help with that. And by thinking that way, it also gets people to think more about what's going on in their systems. And people might say, oh, we're doing things this way, but now that we think about it, we can save a lot of time by changing the way we do that. It gets you to rethink your existing systems, and that should be a continuous process. It's like anytime you change anything, you should think, does this make things harder, easier, anywhere else in the system? And this will encourage the creation of that fair data that we've been talking about. Because that's really the point. We want to get good, clean, usable data out at the end. We want to be able to reuse that data, both sort of internally in our organization, and we want to make it so that people outside the organization, like or academic researchers who have to spend months and months going through libraries, make it easier for them to find the stuff and use it. And there are some really good projects that have been out there. I keep using the Roman Rural Settlement Project, which compiled a lot of data from the ADS and did some fun stuff with it. But this will also kind of show you the idea of data management plans. You'd like to think people would need to be told that data management plans are a good idea and they need to use them, but surprisingly, a lot of people do think you can just wing it and everything works out. No, it doesn't. I think most of us have horror stories of why it doesn't. And maybe most importantly, it takes all these little bits of guidance that exist and tries to sort of apply them to something. So you have a practical idea of, oh, that's what they mean when they talk about, metadata or, file formats. So it's not just this strange arcane thing that only archivists need to worry about. It's something that everyone can understand just by finding the bit they're working on, and they can see exactly which guidance works for it. And obviously pulling all of this together will be a lot of work. And I'm hoping I can get other people interested who want to help compile all of this data and come up with these models and hopefully come up with some really good standards on digital recording and just make all of our lives easier. And I managed to get through that fairly quickly, so I am done.
Perfect timing. Thanks, Mike. So we haven't had any questions. I think Ed's is a bit rhetoric. If you don't like metadata, think about the label on the next tin of food you open. Which bit of information would you be happy to do without? Do we have any questions in the room for Mike? I can't see any hands. Oh, there's Keith.
Oh.
Hi, Keith.
I'm going to keep quiet if anyone else has a question, but I will ask something.
I haven't got any hands up. Go ahead.
It's just trying to tease out, because I like what Mike was saying really resonated. I think it kind of dovetailed quite well with what I had, and I'm interested because the pipeline, I haven't done the process modeling, the kind of similarities to your point about pipelines, and I suppose I'm just trying to wrestle with, there was one point where you kind of said something like you had a line, you put a bullet point up saying the overall process is the same, which I'm really intrigued to find, because I'm really trying to find where some people have documented their, as I say, this, where the process, the bit of the post excavation process, I think is still something I would love. If people want to send me their copies of their PX processes, please do. He says.
I was sort of talking very high level there.
Yeah, because then we went into, and then there's this question of like pipelines. I'm thinking about pipeline for secondary data, I suppose, and I liked your point about at some point there is waste data, and I'm trying to build benefits into this for people. So rather than just hammering people and saying you must do metadata, which I am absolutely agree that metadata is critical, but there are benefits to the people in themselves in being able to get, if they understand the processes and, as you say, have that kind of agreed pipelines even within organizations. I think there is a benefit to getting a bit more consistency in their processes or pipelines, so that they know they can throw stuff away and they're not storing stuff forever. And I think that's perhaps a selling point looking forward, that, you know, in terms of trying to think innovatively, that there are benefits for people. It's not just about hammering people and saying you must use standards. I think there are actual benefits in there within commercially. Yeah,
there definitely are. And as people think about processes, you find ways of improving them. So you can say, we've got this thing that currently takes, however many man hours with every project. Well, actually, we can trim that down to 2. It's just, it does, by thinking big picture and breaking stuff down into your processes, you do spot areas for improvement.
I think I know, and this is, sorry, personally, what's the word, PersCom type experience, that people still find workaround, but the digital world, a lot of the issues I encountered is people actually having, you know, the software that allows it, or feeling comfortable with the software they have as well. I did encounter people who would find workarounds because they weren't very happy with the system, even internal within organizations. And of course, in the challenge is that systems get outdated, and therefore new things come along, and then people want to try the new whizzy thing, and they can't do that in the existing system. So you often get kind of offshoots, shall we say, of process. So it's just I chip that one in, because I you know, we are all humans as well. But
so
sorry.
I think there's a difference between process and procedure. So when you work in a company that is ISO 9001 accredited, you work under processes and procedures. Procedures can be updated as you go along, and I, you know, personally, as a geophysics manager, we would try new things because, you know, technology, and if it improved, then we would write it into the procedures. And that was how this is how I'm thinking Mike's presenting. Am I on the right page? It's an overall process, and procedures depend on your program, depend on your data, that sort of thing.
Yeah, a process is made up of all the procedures. Procedures are the sort of technical steps you do, where process is more an abstract, high-level thing.
Yeah, so you're not arguing that we should have procedures that are standard, but there is a process that would fit everyone.
The individual procedures, and even a lot of the processes to a large extent, are down to the individual organizations. We just kind of want to think, you know, at the end of your system, with all of its process and procedures, we get something compatible.
Cool, thanks. Tom, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, my take from, you know, Mike's pipeline idea is that forget about the bit in the middle as to what's going to happen. It's about having your inputs, the things that we're capturing in the field, the records, the photos, the whatevers, and then having a fairly defined output at the other end, which determines what you do in the middle. And it's making sure that we don't carry on with a process where you have your inputs and then you have a pipe into which you shove things and nobody cares where the other end of the pipe is. It's actually about knowing the ends of the pipe, and that dictates what you do in the middle. And you can change the bits in the middle as long as it gives you the outputs that you want. And as long as you document that so other people know what you've done, that's the important part.
And that comes back to the metadata again.
Yeah.
Kevin.
I think Tom's absolutely right. And of course, one of the problems that I see in commercial archaeology is that end project, that end target, isn't actually what I think we should be doing in archaeology. For example, you know, I see archives where somebody has you know, written a list of contexts, written a list of finds, produced a site matrix. They've used that using a digital format. And efficiencies that have been created by using that digital thing haven't then gone into the next step, which is the synthesis, the analysis. It's almost as if some people believe that the only reason to be in archaeology, or the justification, is, oh, I produce a matrix, I produce a little site summary, but they haven't actually taken it to where we could take it. And you know, one of the advantages of digital archaeology, as Mike suggests, is that we can cut down things that used to take weeks to a number of days. And then what are we doing with the time that we've left on our hands, or the time that we've made available by making ourselves more efficient? You know, so if Tom is right, if that end project was always dissemination in some format, I think I'd be really happy with the pipeline. I suspect, though, that I wouldn't be happy if the end target is just to produce something called the archive without that actually being disseminated or useful in any particular format. And unfortunately, since 1991, since PPG 16 commercial archaeology, that is where most of archaeology has ended up, in that sort of archive, and no intention and no obvious way of funding to get it synthesized and to be produced to make it proper disseminated material.
Yeah, that's the main goal of, well, everything we're working on now is to get it so it is that R in the fair, reusable. Get it out there so people can find it and make it so they can do stuff with it. We want people doing stuff with it.
I mean, we need to avoid the situation where stuff goes in the pipe, halfway along the pipe you spit out a strat report or whatever the minimum requirement is for the client, collect the fee, and then the other end of the pipe is just laying on the grass, spewing out rather than creating product.
Yeah, that's the data fatberg I was talking about.
Yep. Yeah, well, this is it. It's, you know, we need to make sure that people are actually getting useful stuff out, because we're destroying the past by doing the archaeology. We need to make sure we do good things with the results of that destruction.
And I would just echo, yes, the reuse thing. That's why it is becoming more and more critical in terms of understanding what we're doing. And I would just put method. I just like I'm one of the things I'm interested in is whether, you know, we have, to what extent we have these common methods, that it helps to even know that people did or didn't use certain methods. You know, in terms of sort of small scale sites, if you can recognize from the outputs that, and you can just sort of say, well, there was no geophysics on this, or there was no geoarchaeology, nobody did any boreholes, you know, or really what you're asking, what were the common methods that were used, and understand that gives you a really good way in, you know, where it makes sense to share data, sites that have used common methods. So you're trying to interoperate data where they didn't collect it with the same method. That makes harder science. So.
Is it? Well,
Was that a question,
sorry,
or was that a
confused.
statement? You say,
Yeah.
does it?
Does it? Because data is data.
Ooh. That sounds like a big discussion. One of the things I'm looking into is trying to characterize the data, and the data is important. If you're using scientific data, I mean, they're different. What we're not talking about here. So think of free text interpretation. I mean, this is where Mike's spoke about secondary data. I think there's a whole discussion, like, because what people, you know, in the end, one of the products is people are trying to write reports and books. I think that's where the issues in this as well, that we do have other end products that aren't just, and some people feel those are the primary goal. And I think, you know, some of the digital methods are changing some of that, and I think it will continue to change. So, you know, the methods, you know, whether someone, you think SFM doesn't, it's not worth knowing that the data was produced by certain methods.
No, but I do think data collected through different methods is comparable.
In some cases, but you need to understand the methods. If you don't understand, you know, they're completely incompatible methods. That's why you need to understand the methods. So.
Okay. To change subject slightly. Does this emphasis on digital now mean that finally archiving might be appropriately funded within the commercial process?
I can't tell you about the funding, but I would say that people need to be generating the archive, even if they're not depositing it. When a project is finished, it still should be packaged, ready to go to the archive, even if you don't want to pay anybody to take it yet, so that when it is archived, it's ready to go and someone doesn't need to revisit the project to finish it. So it's finished when it's done. But that's just me.
I mean, quite often, as project manager, the archiving was appropriately funded at the beginning of the project. It's just when you get to it. Tom's added in commercial paying for synthesis should be agreed between contractor and client. If it isn't, that's a whole different issue.
Yeah. Well, we've all heard horror stories of organizations that, shall we say, borrow money from one contract to finish off a project in another. And you wind up in this situation where there just isn't the money to do the synthesis that should be done to things. And it keeps going until something horrible breaks.
Do we have any other questions that are directly for Mike? Or shall we take a 10-minute break and get a coffee? All right, people.
10 minutes without microphones and cameras on. We'll be back here.
When do you want us back?
So it is, by mine, 17 minutes past. So 10 minutes from now would be 27.
Why don't we say past?
I think that's a good idea. Yeah,
yep, definitely.
So,
11:30. Thanks, Lucy.
Hello, everyone. I hope you managed to get a cup of tea or whatever floats your boat. Kevin, would you be ready? We're unmuted though. Can't hear you. Can you, or do we need to?
Yeah, sorry, yeah. Yeah, I'm ready if everyone else is okay. Yeah?
Yeah, let's make a start.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. My paper today recalls an online discussion which took place on the Badger Facebook page between the 10th and the 13th of October 2013. And the subject of that discussion was what has gone wrong with digital archaeology and what can put it right. As it happened, that discussion fell very nicely for me, as at the time I was researching a similar subject as part of my MA dissertation. And for that result, I summarised the Badger discussion into a short document, which you can see on the screen. This is available. I'll put a link up at the end, and anyone that wants to read the whole thing can read it through. The form of the discussion over those 4 days was fairly organic, but anyone who can suffer to read through the manuscript will probably suspect there were attempts to manoeuvre the discussion into directions that were useful for my research. I readily admit that that was the case. However, it was an interesting discussion and I think a useful one, and did kind of provide a little benchmark now with hindsight where we can look at the development of digital archaeology 8 years on. It certainly enabled me to come to terms with some of the issues that influence the attitudes of archaeologists towards digital archaeology. And I wonder, however, if any of the issues have actually been resolved. Keith and Mike's papers before suggest that there might still be outstanding issues, some of which we'll see in a minute. Yeah, so hopefully the next 20 minutes or so will help us lead into a wider discussion once I've finished. So all names that I used in this document have been abbreviated to initials. You might recognize some. I hope not. Mine are there, obviously. All contributions were as submitted to the Badger forum. A small number have been edited and the dialogue reordered, but only to make sense and add continuity to the ongoing narrative. And the subheadings are my attempts to categorize the main themes of the dialogue almost into the format of frequently asked questions. Some closely resemble my, next one. Yeah. Sorry, some closely resemble my MA dissertation research questions, yeah, we'll see where it goes. So anyway, so the first theme that I've got is technology cannot be trusted. And, you know, 8 years ago, there were people out there who believed that, you know, anything that didn't involve you physically getting your hands on you know, paper, pens, dirt, artifacts was problematic. And you know, I suspect there is still a little kind of frisson of that. So this is a contribution made by JP. Digital relies on electricity, battery or mains, and working computers to enjoy these 3D rendered images. The discipline is young, digital even younger. I won't read the whole thing. I can, however, read my copy of Mortimer's 1905 40-year researches in British and Saxon burial mounds of East Yorkshire by candlelight if necessary. And power cuts do happen. So putting all your eggs in the digital basket may not be such a brilliant plan in the long view. I can fully understand this attitude. When I started my master's dissertation, I was very much convinced that you know, the whole world of archaeology could go digital and we could dispense with paper for once and for all. By the time I finished my research, I'd actually changed that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But anyway, there was a response to JP's thing by me, and I said, for example, that reading in the dark as an analogy wasn't a good one, because of course smartphone technology allows access to internet and data sources unknown a few years back. And as I said, I carried out a rough survey of archaeologists within earshot, and whilst 100% of them had a mobile phone at or about their person, not one had a candle on them right now. So in a sense, there was you know, a practical solution to JP's suggestion. But we moved on a little bit further, and JP came back to me and said, obviously he respected me, all that rubbish. But he wanted to make 2 points. Of course, that the output was only as good as the data, and it's harder to interrogate the data than it was, as the data and the system are intimately intertwined. And I think that is a good point. And I think it's something that kind of both Keith and Mike were talking about as well, that you know, there is a comparison between having stuff on paper and having to access stuff through the means of a machine. And also the point JP makes is that there is a blurring between the record and the interpretation. And this is something I totally agree with. I think we have to make it very clear in our archiving of digital data as to what is the raw data and what is the data which has been processed. And this isn't quite as easy as it sounds. For example, you know, anyone that's used structure for motion, you know, we buy this nice little software package, it kind of puts all those photos together into a little sort of mosaic, and it produces as a result in 2D or 3D. But how many people actually know what the algorithm that the Russian company that set up this thing is, and how it actually does, you know, manipulate the data? And again, you know, I've seen structure from motion photographs and models in archives, and there's nothing in the metadata that suggests, you know, how that end result was obtained. So again, I think that is a good point, that we do have to keep, you know, our raw data and our synthesized, analyzed data separate. The second point is slightly more fatuous, I think. Satellite systems which support GIS, I think he really meant GPS, are inherently fragile and may literally fall down for all kinds of cosmic and geopolitical reasons. And anyone, for example, who's worked out on Salisbury Plain will know when the British military put blockers out when they're doing certain kinds of exercise, so that satellites don't work, which is damn annoying if you're running a GNSS at the time. And then also JP makes the point, of course, that back when we used slide rules, we know how to understand the calculation. And anyone, of course, that uses a push button total station or a GNSS probably doesn't have to know how the thing works, just assume that it is accurate. And maybe sometimes, particularly for surveyors, we do need to have a little bit more background knowledge, just in case we have to revert to a different system. So that's the first theme: technology cannot be trusted. And I'll ask you whether or not that is still the case for people in archaeology in this country or abroad, in particularly whether there is a difference between maybe people at one end of the food chain in archaeology and other people at the other, as to whether or not they believe or whether or not they're actually even bothered, so whether to be trusted or not. Theme two that we picked up from this conversation was, you know, the skills that we used to train people on. We call these analog skills, training and technology in general. You know, if you don't know how to use it, where do you learn? Do you learn at the sake of those older trusted skills? You know, learning how to plan, draw a section, all the kind of things that most of us were brought up on. And I started this conversation pointing out that, of course, when my early training was all of an analog nature, and those skills don't just disappear because of the rise of digital technology. Maybe I should have added, of course, but if you're not trained in them in the first place, then you won't have those skills to fall back on. And I said also, you know, I think with analog skills, it did allow for a more nuanced appreciation of the benefits of digitalization. Is it an improvement on the way that things have been previously done? As I say, I'm not sure that old skills are being taught or even being practiced enough to use efficiently and customarily. And of course, you know, any analog skill still has to be practiced to make it worthwhile. Anyone that's been on a field school, for example, will say, hear lots of times, oh yeah, I did that once, but I haven't done it. Basically, it requires them to learn all over again. But my other point is that I don't necessarily blame that on digital technology. I blame that on general cost cutting in all kinds of professional roles, and not just archaeology. And of course, since this original conversation in 2013, Dave Connolly at Badger has now produced the skills passport, where in fact, you know, many of those additional skills are still considered to sort of underpin anything that we do in archaeology. And again, this produced a response, this time by EMI. I understand your points. It can offer a huge amount. Much equipment is bought, staff trained. It doesn't have to de-skill or edge out the ground level staff. My worry is how accessible that training is. Totally agree. Those without training in all these things who aren't currently employed don't stand a chance. That I think is also the case. There may be cheap free technologies out there, but where is the cheap accessible training? Good point. I know that Historic England hope to address this in the next couple of years. That they have an innovative scheme which they hope to get running next year, providing fields training outside of the normal university system. And let's hope that's a success. And EMI goes on to say, I never had a chance to learn how to use GIS, and no university or company has ever thought it worth their time to train lower level workers. And I think there is a point there, and I will come to address that as we go on. And EMI then also asks, how do I go about getting this training without it costing me a lot of money? Again, very good point. You know that you know, certainly at the bottom of the food chain, lots of archaeologists don't earn a lot, and sometimes training can be very expensive. EMI also goes on to say, I guess that when equipment isn't available, there's no choice but to use the old methods. Yes, true. It seems digital tech can be really useful, but there seems to be a little bit of snobbery about it. And I find the site matrix helps me sort out in my head what's going on, yeah, etc., etc. And I think this is a good point. I wouldn't say it's exactly snobbery, but there is certainly, I think, practice over the last 8 years has shown that lots of organisations do kind of believe that the digital technology is a reserved job. It isn't one which is available to every single person on the excavation. We probably all know of lots of excavations where somebody turns up once a week or once a fortnight with the GNSS and they measure in all of the things that people have been digging for the last fortnight, often without asking them at the time, can they confirm what's going on? And certainly very, very little feedback coming back to those people who excavated at a later point. The information goes away to some office, and as Keith pointed out, it may then get processed through, it may end up in the archive, it may end up even in a publication, but without very little input or reciprocal, without any further additions from the staff who actually produced the original data. And I think EMI makes a good point there. and I'm pretty sure it is one that hasn't really been solved in the last 8 years. I made the point that obviously, you know, we do have to adapt, and I used the analogy of having a set of rotary pens, and I thought, yeah, one day I'll use them again, and then it's 20 years, and I thought, well, it would be nice to get your fingernails dirty, but it's unlikely to happen. And if even if it did happen, it's unlikely that the commissioner of the work would pay me a fair day's wage for the amount of work involved. So the pens went off to the charity shop. We also made a point earlier in this conversation about gridding up sites, and I said, well, you know, I don't believe that we any longer need to put metal pins in the ground at 5-meter intervals, and it's basically it was a tool of the 80s, and one that because of the total station and GPS, that we no longer needed to practice in its entirety. So this brings us on to theme three, and I guess this was kind of both what Mike and Keith were getting at, that technology, data standards, and digital archiving. So people were thinking about this 8 years ago. It isn't an entirely new thing. Maybe there has been a lack of progress, and that's probably what is surprising. SR, what about standards and compatibility? There's no agreed set of instructions for heading into this digital realm. I think that's still true. It clearly hasn't been thought through. I think it's been thought through and it's just been ignored, actually, but never mind. It's all being determined by commercial firms as to what is acceptable, which will often mean cost becomes more prominent than quality. Yeah, that's maybe a point. Should the decisions be left to contractors to determine for themselves? The other thing about contractors is an awful lot of self-taught people out there. They pass on knowledge, it gets passed on in turn, which means who knows if things are actually being done correctly. If someone with proper training from, say, a civil engineering background were to review working practices, would they be impressed, horrified, or amused? I think that it doesn't necessarily be civil engineering. It just needs to be somebody who knows something about you know, the way that archaeologists tend to adapt other technologies, other processes as their own. And yeah, I mean, we've had this discussion with geologists over the years and with other sort of natural scientists, haven't we? My reply to this one was that you know, on one hand, there's introducing and integrating technology into current practice whilst preserving the integrity of the record. And I couldn't find any evidence that technology lowered the standards, although of course shoddy work is just as achievable with or without a TST or a digital camera. My aim was, as far as possible, to train and allow all staff to be users of the technology, from the lowliest digger to the highest manager. Of course, there is a balance to be achieved. We still do some things better in an analog way, and therefore there is a challenge to try and integrate that analog record into a digital archive. There are, however, some things which are better done totally digital, mainly through efficiencies in time. And this was the point when my master's dissertation started moving away from, yes, we can be totally digital, to no, we have to find a balance. And in fact, my end conclusion was that, and again, speaking to you know, commercial archaeologists, many of them believed, and I think quite rightly, that their experienced staff could record, could excavate, could produce data as quickly and as efficiently in an analog form as they could digitally. Mainly talking, to example, to archaeologists working in the City of London. You know, one of them said to me, you know, how can I get a satellite signal when I'm in the basement, double basement of a bank on Bishopsgate? And I think that's true. You know, that sometimes we have to revert to you know, our analog way and sort of digitize it in a sense later, because the circumstances dictate. That's just a reality. SR comes back though. This is a big, long sort of rant, I guess. You know, I think he kind of agrees that, you know, there are ways of producing data digitally and an analog form, but he wasn't sure what was going into the archive anymore. And I think, you know, we've heard that earlier this morning. You know, and then he goes on to give examples, you know, about drawing features by hand as opposed to drawing them, you know, using a digital stick, and then, you know, relying on the interpretation, or do you interpret as you draw more than you would do if you were using a GNSS or a total station? And he makes a point, we may be losing much more than we realize. And of course, at that time, and I guess still at this time, there isn't actually a comparative exercise out there which shows whether or not you know, an excavation is being produced as efficiently and as comprehensively using digital methods as it would have been under the old analog system. And of course, we all know that the analog system in itself wasn't ever perfect. So I think he does make a very good point. Theme 4 is what I described as the democracy of technology. As I mentioned earlier, I think there was 8 years ago, and I think still today, there is a reservation about digital technology, that some people believe it's almost their future to, you know, having a permanent contract. Basically, if I'm the only person that can use the TST or the digital camera, then they're hardly likely to get rid of me. And that is one of the reasons I think that you know, allowing all staff access to all equipment has been sort of held back. There is also, you know, as mentioned in the earlier thing, the cost of training and making sure that people are efficient. SR here says, you know, are we not in danger of heading back to a situation where there's a division between archaeological labourers doing the dirty work and the tech-savvy folks who do the recording but don't dig? And we might all remember, if we've been around long enough, the days when, you know, somebody came in to do the planning. You were allowed to do the digging, but you weren't entrusted to use a sharp pencil. He also wonders, you know, whether if older archaeologists are reluctant to adapt to new technology, whether or not they would actually end up being kind of forced out of the profession, or at least sidelined into sort of, you know, a less kind of crucial thing. I think, you know, we were discussing almost the exact opposite, the separation of the workforce into small, highly valued tech-savvy segments, and a devalued and unappreciated lumpen, as he calls it, the traulatariat, a good word, who do the grunt work and receive no credit. You know, and I mean, over certainly the last 20 or 30 years, Keith mentioned Chateau-Huic, you know, we have made efforts to try and make sure that everyone's involvement in archaeology, from the bottom to the top, is more than just being there as a, you know, somebody to shift earth. And of course, there is a danger that you know, digital technology is going to sort of dissipate those advances. As I say here in my reply, the point I was trying to make was that technology can give staff a greater involvement in all aspects of the process. And I wouldn't speak for the motives of others, but you know, I've noticed that access to technology has been discouraged, and I assume because fearful of the way that might shift the power balance within an organisation or even in a small workforce. If digital technology is highlighting the pre-existing problems, however, it is the problems that should be addressed and not the tools, and digital archaeology in this sense is the tool. And then SR came back to me and said, well, you know, replying to my thing, he says he doesn't find it sinister, but he puts it down to lazy arsehole employers who have no interest in investing in the skills of their staff, who they see as short-term and disposable. Well, thankfully, we no longer have that situation, and all archaeological employers now value the skills of their staff for as long as they issue them with contracts, isn't it? The situation you're talking about, where all staff are getting trained up, is very different from where I think most UK firms were in 2013. I think the situation has changed a little, but maybe not too much. And I take it that where you work, I was working in Norway at the time, an EDM, I think he means a TST, is pretty much available for every project where it's needed. And a lot of digital stuff becomes nigh on impossible when a company has only 1 or 2 pieces of kit or operators, etc., etc. And he says here, you know, definitely go digital, but commit to it fully and to do it properly. So the last part that I want to highlight from this earlier conversation is I am obsolete due to the pace of technology. And of course, you know, again, many of our older archaeologists felt that, you know, because they couldn't use digital methods, they weren't allowed in some cases, they had nowhere to store the data, I guess in an organization, that's the end of the story, paper and pencil, string and tapes rule. And strange that so much of archaeology deals with changes in technology and the relations between cultural change and technological change, but archaeologists are so technophobic. And then CJT says 23 years and I have no idea how to use a GPS. And these diggers are becoming multi-skilled and the techies specialize out of where we do this job. So we come to the conclusions, and I think I've just taken one. There were several. GC, this will be a very bad thing. Just look at Germany, where you still have the labourers be on unemployment relief schemes, the archaeologists who don't know how to dig, photographers who can work cameras but don't understand what they're supposed to be photographing, and then computer nerds who can write all kinds of cool but totally unnecessary code and don't understand a thing about archaeology. Well, fortunately, we don't fall into that trap, do we? And then MSM says, it's obvious, I need to get out more, which I think is just about where the conversation sort of died off after 4 days. So my question is, has anything changed in the past 8 years? And I have suggested in this little presentation that some things have, but some things I think we're still, you know, asking without answering many of those questions raised 8 years ago. So that's it, that's the thing. And as I say, I've got a link here to the original discussion document, but it's a rather long one. So if anyone wants it, I can give it to them at a later point. Yeah. Thanks, and that's it.
Great, thanks, Kevin. If you wanted to pop the link in the chat, then it's there for the people who are here. That would be awesome. Do we have any questions specifically for Kevin?
I don't mind if this just goes into the general discussion.
Well, what we were going to do is for the general discussion, we were going to switch off the cameras so people felt a bit more.
Okay, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin.